Hampton, New Hampshire, in April 1917, when the United States of America declared war on Germany, was a quaint, quiet seacoast town with a population of 1,250 people. The community was made of retail business owners, farmers, craftsmen, and fishermen. The Boston and Maine Railroad connected the place to the rest of the world, along with the street trolley and the newly introduced automobile. The suffragette and temperance movements were alive and well in the town. Churches and organizations like the Grange, Oddfellows, and the Masons welcomed all. The thought of a war with Germany was a new concept to address in Hampton daily life. The beach was just coming into vogue as a destination vacation spot to bring the family and relax during the heat of summer. Locals and visitors alike entertained themselves with beach foods, airplane rides, theater, music, baseball games, and the carnival events in August. Residents were quick to respond to the war effort. Local farmers agreed to increase food production. Individuals planted victory gardens. Even the vagrants and tramps were taken into custody and put to work in the fields. The Hampton branch of the American Red Cross was organized. Liberty bonds were sold to finance the war. Hampton residents bought thousands of dollars in support. The Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts helped with selling war bonds and with the planting and maintaining of the victory gardens. 12-year-old Alzina Levitt organized a group called the Betsy Ross Knitting Club to knit squares for the American Red Cross. The consequences of entering the World War left no place or family immune to the effects of the war in Hampton. Citizens took up the call to help in any way they could. All able-bodied men and women from Hampton signed up to serve in the armed forces. There were no casualties among the Hampton soldiers and nurses. All would return home from the war. Many homes in the town would have had a service flag in the window to honor the men and women from their household who were serving on the war front. During the Memorial Day Parade in 1917, Hampton veterans and Boy Scouts lined up on Lafayette Road to honor the war veterans. Posters promoting the war effort would have been seen throughout the town and beach. The war had begun, and Hampton was ready to cooperate in all lines of patriotic service as loyal citizens of the United States of America.
During the war, one of the primary ways the American government encouraged military service and rallied support for the war effort on the home front was through the use of posters. The Uncle Sam I Want You poster is probably the most famous of all, but there were hundreds of distinctive designs created, and these posters have become icons of the era due to their powerful graphical impact. Here is a small sampling of these stirring examples of the communication arts.
$1,000,000 Yankee hits will blow you into bits. Hey, Fritz, you're fighting Yankee wits. Before we go, you want to know it's time you called it quits. For you can't beat us, beat us into old Berlin. You're bound to meet us, but you can't defeat us. We're going in to win. We'll make you wish you never went to war. fight you like you never fought before. You can beat us, can beat us if it takes 10 million more. Say, Fritz, why don't you take a tip when you know this Yankee ship is giving you the slip? Hey, Fritz, when Uncle Sammy's grip begins to yank that German flank, then something's got to rip. For you can't beat us, beat us into old Berlin. You're bound to meet us, but you can't defeat us. We're going in to win. We'll fight you now and then we'll fight you more. Fight you till we've made the Kaiser roar. You can't beat us, if it takes 10 million more.
On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson appeared before Congress to ask for a declaration of war against Germany due to that country's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare and its attempts to form an alliance with Japan and Mexico. 4 days later, on April 6th, America went to war. The following month, General John J. Pershing was selected to command the American Expeditionary Forces going to Europe. Over the next 18 months, he would transform the ill-prepared American military into a disciplined fighting force. However, at the start of the war, America had a standing army of only about 200,000 men, and that included National Guard members. The size of the military had to be increased dramatically, and relying on volunteers alone would not be enough. Consequently, Congress passed the Selective Service Act in May, which required all men between the ages of 21 and 30 to register for military service. Over 2.5 million men would be drafted. Also in May, Britain and the United States implemented a sophisticated convoy system to protect merchant ships and troop carriers. This tactic enabled the movement of large numbers of American soldiers to Europe with very few casualties. In June, General Pershing arrived in Paris to coordinate activities with the British and French allies. At times, his relations with the Allied generals would be difficult due to his insistence on an independent American fighting force. Also in June, over 14,000 American soldiers arrived in France. By December, more than 180,000 troops would be on duty. Ultimately, over 2 million American soldiers would serve in France and Italy. Overall, the American Expeditionary Forces fought in at least 16 engagements of varying degrees of intensity. Here's a quick overview of those actions. All of these engagements occurred in 1918, other than the 1917 Battle of Cambrai, and all were fought in France except Vittorio Veneto, which occurred in Italy. Out of these battles and operations would come stirring stories of how the U.S. Marines displayed a ferocious tenacity at the Battle of Belleau Wood, of how the African-American infantry unit, nicknamed the Harlem Hellfighters by the Germans, would see more combat than any other American unit, of how the heroic Lost Battalion survived a harrowing 5 days and nights surrounded by Germans in the Argonne Forest, and of how the humble Sergeant Alvin York, a pacifist, would become America's greatest war hero due to the actions he and his men undertook during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The war ended at 11 a.m. November 11, 1918. The last soldier killed was an American who died 1 minute before the armistice started. The contribution of the American Expeditionary Forces was twofold. Besides providing the Allies with 2 million fresh troops to hasten the defeat of Germany, its presence also raised the morale of Allied soldiers and civilians, as well as demoralizing the German military and populace. To quote General Pershing, "Our armies, hurriedly raised and hastily trained, met a veteran enemy and by courage, discipline, and skill always defeated him." On a bronze tablet in front of the Lane Memorial Library, there are the names of 54 men and 2 women who served in World War I and who were associated with Hampton in one way or another. Some would serve in Europe alongside the more than 2 million men and women of the American Expeditionary Forces. Others would serve in the critical convoys that shuttled troops and supplies to Europe. 2 of them would provide nursing care to the sick and wounded, and a number would spend the war in training camps. Here are profiles of a few of our local heroes.
Leonora Bradley Marston Wing and Jeanette Packard White offered their service as trained nurses for the war effort. Jeanette White was 39 years old when she was deployed in 1918 as an Army nurse with the American Expeditionary Forces under General John J. Pershing's command. She was one of 90 nurses who tended to the wounded at Camp Hospital No. 54 in Le Mans, France, taking in nearly 1,500 casualties a month in a 1,700-bed old monastery. Jeanette would return to Hampton after the war, living with her sister-in-law Nellie Moulton White. She helped take care of the children after her brother Charles had passed away of typhoid pneumonia. She remained a nurse until her death in 1956. Leonora Wing reported to Camp Dix, New Jersey, in August of 1918. She would, in 1921, after the war, complete 3 years of training in the Army School of Nursing at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. She married Edward Payson Wing, Jr. in Hampton, New Hampshire in 1912. On April 27, 1918, Corporal Wing was killed in action in France. He was a member of the 102nd Machine Gun Battalion Company B. Leonora later lived with her aunt Adeline Marston in Hampton and worked at the Deaconess Hospital in Boston. She was a writer who wrote under the pen names Lucia Folger and Lee Folger in the late 1940s.
The Bucher boys were the sons of the Reverend Fred Bucher and his wife Ellen of the First Baptist Church of Hampton. There were 5 boys and 3 girls in the Bucher clan. After America entered the war, Kenneth and Harold enlisted, and Kenneth went for training at Camp Lee in Virginia. On September 12, 1918, Gerald, Raymond, and Richard all enlisted and went to student training camps. Richard and Raymond were identical twins. They both attended Bates College in Maine, where they were known for their running abilities. Raymond would become famous as a sprinter, placing 5th in the 1,500-meter race at the 1924 Summer Olympics in Paris. He may possibly be in the circled area of this photo of that event. Interestingly, the 1924 Summer Olympics was featured in the Oscar-winning film Chariots of Fire. Both Raymond and Richard would later minister with the American Baptist Foreign Mission Society in Burma, Thailand, and China. It should also be noted that Richard, who had a degree from Harvard Medical School, would join the U.S. Army twice more and do service in the Walter Reed Hospital, in Brazil, and in the Surgeon General's office. He was honorably discharged with the rank of major. In their own ways, all 5 of the Bucher boys proudly served their country.
Marvin Fisher Young was one of the first men to enlist from Hampton in April 1917. He trained under Captain Elvin Foss at Fort Stark in Newcastle, New Hampshire. From the Hamptons Union, July 26, 1917, Corporal Marvin Young and Stanley Fogg, members of the Coast Artillery Company, left Exeter this morning for Fort Stark. There was a great send-off at Exeter. The stores closed, and accompanying the music of the band, crowds cheered the company on its way. Marvin would later go on to more training camps at Fort Slocum, New York, Camp Dix, New Jersey, and Camp Upton, Long Island. After the war, Mr. Young served on the police and fire departments in Hampton. The kids in Hampton knew him as Majestic Marvin, traffic cop and speed trap for automobiles who sped through town. He was a post commander for the American Legion Post No. 35. Marvin is buried in the Young family plot at the Hampton High Street Cemetery.
At the age of 22, Percy Brown enlisted in the United States Army in July 1917. He began serving as a private in a brigade of the 7th Infantry Division. He would have worn this military insignia. He went to France with the American Expeditionary Forces. Over there, he rode a motorcycle and delivered messages to the Allied forces. During his tour of duty, he would participate in the following engagements: the Second Battle of the Marne, the Battle of the Saint-Mihiel Salient, and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. In the post-war celebrations, Percy drove in the Hampton Beach Victory Carnival, which took place in September 1919. He can be seen here at the wheel of a decked-out float car. Percy would become the proprietor of the Casino Garage at Hampton Beach. Later, he would join the Hampton Fire Department and work alongside Marvin Young. As an interesting side note, Percy's father, Alexander, had earlier been the chief of the Hampton Beach Fire Station, and he and Percy built this fire truck. Percy Brown is the father of Hampton businessman Stanwood S. Brown.
Harry Newton Elwell's mother, Elizabeth Hall Palmer, was from Hampton. In 1915, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. He was part of the 101st Regiment Field Artillery Battery F, the 1st Massachusetts Field Artillery. In 1916, Elwell's regiment was mustered into federal service during the border conflict with Mexico. They were the first regiment to arrive at the border stationed at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas. The 101st was again called into action during World War I, arriving in France September 25, 1917. Harry Newton Elwell was honorably discharged from service as 2nd Lieutenant Field Artillery on July 26, 1919. Harry is listed as an electrician in the 1920s census, but his primary job was as toll taker at the Hampton River mile-long bridge. He also worked with the Hampton Fire Department. His grandson, John Mason, lives in his home on Winnicott Road in Hampton, keeping memorabilia about his grandfather in safekeeping in Harry's U.S. Army trunk. His picture on the wall at the American Legion Post 35 shows that he was an active member of the American Legion in Hampton, New Hampshire, serving as post commander in 1934. He passed away at the Veterans Hospital in Tongass, Maine in 1940. He is buried in the Hampton High Street Cemetery.
During the war, thousands of idealistic young Americans eagerly volunteered to drive ambulances in support of the Allies. One was a 19-year-old college student from Hampton, New Hampshire. In May 1917, 1 month after America entered the war, Rupert joined the Clark College Ambulance Unit. Shortly thereafter, he was sent to France and supported the American Hospital of Paris by transporting wounded soldiers from the incoming trains to the hospital. Later, he would transport casualties from the front lines to field hospitals. In January 1918, he was absorbed into the U.S. Army and was sent to the Northern Italian Front and was assigned to the same unit that Ernest Hemingway had served in earlier. During his tour of duty, Rupert wrote a number of revealing letters to a young woman named Ernestine, who lived in Hampton, New Hampshire. These letters reflect a comfortable candor in sharing both the harsh and satisfying moments of his life on the front. Here are two of the letters. September 1st, 1917, the French Front. Dear Ernestine, the last time I wrote I was leaving for the front, wasn't I? Well, I went and saw and did, and here I am still in range of cannon. The French infantry took Lamore home in Hill 304, and it was interesting to see the French artillery moved up and the wonderful rapidity of the advance all along. But the other side of it, the wounded and dead during the attack. Men often died before we could reach the hospital, the car covered with blood and all. That's what tries a fellow's nerve, if anything. But for a while that is all over for us. We are on repo in Triancourt. The best part of it is that you can get something to eat, omelet, wine, toasted bread, butter, and all the jam you can eat. That is what we all like to get back for after living on sardines and boiled beef. For this time, so to say, but I hope to hear from you soon. Perhaps then I shall not be a volunteer ambulancer, but with the U.S. Army. Most sincerely, Roop. November 7th, 1918, the Italian Front. Dear Ernestine, I was sent down on the Piave River on the 23rd of October, and the same night was sent out to a post on the river called Cavalli, where everything was ready for the offensive. The bombardment came on the night of the 25th, and under the artillery fire, the Italians put up 2 bridges. 2 brigades got across before the bridges were blown up by the Austrians, and all that day there was lively fighting. For a while, things looked very doubtful. I was sent from my post to a town 4 kilometers up the river where there were 8 soldiers severely wounded. The road was lined with trenches full of soldiers ready to cross. Shells were flying everywhere. Searchlights were all over the place where the wounded were. Luckily, I got the first load back to the hospital before I fell into one monstrous large shell hole. By the time I arrived for the second load, it was getting daylight, and I could see the bridge and the French and Italians hurrying across. The Austrians were shelling heavily, and many of the soldiers never made it. I saw one man thrown into the air in 2 parts, and one part of him stuck in the remains of a tree. For once, I never expected to return from that trip, and to this minute, I don't understand how I got back without even as much as a scratch. Remember I said some months ago that the war might be over by Christmas? What do you think of it now? There's only Germany left, and she can't stand it long. As ever, most sincerely, Roop.
November 11th became known as Armistice Day and later Veterans Day. On the 11th month, 11th day, and the 11th hour, the guns of World War I fell silent. The Hamptons Union reported, "Last Monday saw many and varied demonstrations in recognition of the signing of the armistice, which ends the Great War. The bells were ringing all day. There were parades, and in the evening, a large demonstration of marchers with music, colored fire, fireworks, bonfires, etc. Soon the soldiers and nurses would be returning home to a Hampton not much changed by the war. There were a lot more automobiles on the road, and the radio had become a common item in Hampton homes. Hampton and the beach were growing in an economic surge as people had more money to spend. Still, people bought bonds and supported the Red Cross post-war efforts. But it was time to build America. Wartime restrictions had been lifted, allowing more freedom to grow the peacetime economy. In 1918, to add to the terrible loss from war, Hampton was affected by the worldwide flu-influenza epidemic. This was a disease spread by human contact, chiefly through coughing, sneezing, and spitting. The doctors of Hampton were busy with over 200 cases of the influenza reported in the community. 3 people at the beach died of the flu. Pharmacist Victor G. Garland died from complications of the flu at the young age of 27. $20 to 40 million soldiers and civilians died worldwide from this epidemic. Brewing within the politics of the world was unrest after the war. Intolerance did increase as a direct result of the war. The Ku Klux Klan had 5 million members by 1925. 700 strong, under white sheets and cone hats, the KKK would march through the town of Hampton in 1925 to a gathering on Mill Road. The blame for the war was directed at Germany. Harsh terms of the peace treaties made it difficult for the country to recover. Germany looked forward to the day of revenge, and within 21 years, Hampton's men and women would be again marching to war. Little was solved worldwide by this war that took 38 million military and civilian lives and laid devastation on the countries where the war was fought. World War I ranks among the deadliest conflicts in human history. As a direct result of World War I, the American Legion Post No. 35 was established in 1933 to preserve the bonds of service and to support their fellow veterans in their communities. Many of the soldiers from World War I became charter members. The Legion Hall was at the Fire Station No. 2 on the corner of Academy Ave and Wanacunnet Road. This day, November 11th, 1919, was a day to remember. The day was the first anniversary of the official end of World War I. The whole town was involved in one way or another, if not as a participant in the planning, the parade, dedication, and ball, then as a spectator. The entire town rallied to remember. To honor those returned, a dinner was given at the Congregational Church. 130 were present with soldiers, sailors, Grand Army of the Republic, speakers, and invited guests. A parade of floats and bands marched through the town, terminating at the Lane Memorial Library, where bronze tablets were unveiled, on which the names of those who had served in the war from Hampton were inscribed. Addresses were given in the town hall in the afternoon. In the evening, a concert and dance topped off the Welcome Home celebration with an 8-piece orchestra.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row that mark our place, and in the sky the lark still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw a sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.